Since before recorded time, it had swung through the universe in an elliptical orbit so large that its very existence remained a secret of time and space. But now, in the last few years of the 20th century, the visitor was returning.
Comet takes place in the post-apocalyptic future of the 1980s, where big hair rules and everything is an excuse for a street party, until a flash in the night changes everything. Now all that remains are a handful of survivors in a fight for their lives. Let's see how they do.
But he's gone.
What? What you talking about, Pig?
The story, in short, answers an age-old question asked for hundreds of years. What happens if the fate of humanity rests not upon the shoulders of the wise and strong, but a pair of self-absorbed teenagers? And what a noble question that is indeed.
Sweater cost $80.
Let's not kid ourselves here. As far as movie premises go, there's little out there as ridiculous as this. Executed from beginning to end, the story gets more and more far-fetched, begging us to believe the most bizarre things. It's a train wreck waiting to happen, and yet the very same qualities that define Comet as so bad make it an enjoyment to watch. Just waiting to see what lines will be crossed next kept me glued to my seat to the end, if just for those no they did not moments. It's stories like this that keep people like me watching bad films. But as enjoyable as it was, the story is still a train wreck from beginning to end, and in my book that earns a well-deserved D. Now let's meet these young ladies entrusted with the future of humanity. Put your hands together for Earth's survivors. First off, we have Regina, the main character of Comet. We see what an important life that Reggie lives working at the local movie theater. This wisecracking, intelligent teenager shows her independence by not actually doing any work there, but instead plays video games and fraternizes with another employee in a projection booth. Just the kind of girl to save the world with. Not to be outdone by her older sister, Samantha is the most clueless and self-absorbed girl anywhere. When she's not cheering on the team, this girl is cutting down the undead with the best of them, all while sporting the latest in 1980s fashion. Little Samantha has it all, except a single clue to what's going on outside her little bubble.
Great.
And to wrap up the main cast, we have Hector. Lost and looking for love, we have our lone male of the survivors. And to balance out our pair of high school girls, what kind of guy do we see? A good-looking teenage boy full of hormones? No, instead we have a truck driver. Yes, the one man that managed to stave the destruction of humanity is a truck driver rescued by the cab of his truck. A man so brave that he hides from two girls and runs from a pint-sized zombie because he likes kids. What a heroic guy. Yes, the fate of humanity rests upon the shoulders of three misfits. And lacking any survival skills, it's a miracle these three can survive a day, much less the end of the world. But at least the girls have some weapon experience. Could it get any more silly than that? Why, yes, it can. Not only are these three up against the annihilation of the entire human race, but also their fellow survivors. And what makes these mutilated survivors so deadly, you ask? How about some talking zombies? Yes, you heard that right, talking zombies. And let's not forget about the silly and over-the-top group of scientists that were supposed to continue humanity's plight after the apocalypse. The same guys that predicted such an event were unable to stop a pair of teenagers from escaping, not to mention being so smart that they infect themselves with a deadly virus after forgetting to close their vents. Nice one, guys. All in all, these characters are two-dimensional and rather silly. Oftentimes events that were meant to be serious and scary came off rather humorous. But that's not always a bad thing, especially when you know you're watching a bad movie. Taking that into account, I have to say the characters are still a bit thin and over the top to take seriously. I gave them a well-deserved D. Looks like these girls need to go back to school. When compared to today's standards, most of these older low-budget films look rather silly, but oftentimes these same low-budget effects give off a certain nostalgic charm to fans of the era. Do we see such a charm here? Yes and no. Operating on a low budget, the creators of Comet made use of many staple effects and camera tricks popular in the early 1980s. Fans of the era will recognize them time after time, but there are only so many places that filter effects and camera tricks can take you. A poorly crafted low-budget film looks bad no matter how much cult nostalgia you coat it with. Some people may disagree with me, but even compared to other films of the era, the effects in Comet are just plain laughable and bad. And under those circumstances, I'm forced to give them a big fat F. The once bustling streets of LA are now quiet. What's left is an empty world, once filled with humans, but now left with clothes and small piles of dust. Were that not enough, most of those that were not turned to dust became something much worse. The Walking Dead. Not a happy place for the last remaining survivors of humanity. Despite the low budget, Comet's settings and scenery are one of the few areas of the film done quite well. With well-executed wide shots, your eyes travel through open scenes of a lifeless cityscape filled with little more than cloth and dust. It creates an almost haunting image of loneliness for our characters, reminding both them and the viewers that they are really alone in the world. It really does make Comet feel quite atmospheric at times, but not all is well with the setting. While that openness conveys isolation well, it brings yet another of Comet's weaknesses forward, a lack of locations. I may be forgetting a location or two here, but for the most part, the entirety of Comet takes place in a total of 5 places, and that would be fine were they done well, but most of them did little to stand out or offer significance. What we see instead are a handful of locations that look remarkably small and bland. It's not to say I was expecting to see something massive and extravagant, but it would have been nice to be somewhere that stood out apart from the others. You can only look at so many tight, confined rooms in one sitting. Considering both sides of the topic, this is still the strongest part of Comet, and with that in mind, I give the setting a solid C. Now here's the big one, the complete package. So many films can have the greatest story, characters, effects, and settings, and yet somehow something is still missing. Another can create masterpieces with far less, and so many others are somewhere in the middle. Going into Comet, you have to take a few things into consideration before making a final decision. Will these things change your mind about the film? Probably not, but it will affect your enjoyment level. First off, Comet is extremely dated. There is no getting past the fact that it screams everything about the 1980s. The big hair, massive phones, clothing stereotypes, and dialogue cliches are all here in a total throwback to the era, and for some people, that is enough to tickle their fancy, and for others, it will turn them off. Next is the budget. People go back and forth all day long about the importance of a film's budget and effects. As for me, sometimes those low-budget effects can bring more enjoyment than the most well-polished high-budget film, but not always. And lastly, we know that Comet is a bad film. With its silly premise and over-the-top characterizations, there is little to expect here other than a lot of campy fun. And for some of us, watching a bad film like this brings a different kind of pleasure. Is it something I'd watch more than once? Probably not. But I have to say that it was an amusing experience the first time. Still, there's no denying that Night of the Comet is a bad film and earns a well-deserved D in my book.